August 10, 1943, a date that would haunt the Luftwaffe's leadership for years to come, found General Adolf Galland standing in the opulent conference room of Carinhall, Hermann Göring's estate, north of Berlin. The young fighter ace, barely 40 years old but already bearing the weight of Germany's entire fighter defense on his shoulders, clutched intelligence reports that told a story his superior refused to hear. Outside, the summer sun blazed over the Reich. But inside that room, a chill settled over the gathering as Galland prepared to speak words that would shatter Göring's carefully constructed illusions about the air war. The atmosphere crackled with tension as Galland laid photographs across the mahogany table. These weren't ordinary reconnaissance images. They showed American Lockheed P-38 Lightning fighters, distinctive with their twin-boom design, operating deep over German-occupied France. What made these photographs extraordinary was their location. These aircraft had been spotted more than 400 miles from their bases in England, a distance that conventional wisdom deemed impossible for escort fighters. Galland had received these reports from his frontline pilots, men whose lives depended on accurate intelligence, men who swore they'd engage these twin-engine predators far beyond what anyone thought feasible. Göring, resplendent in his powder blue uniform adorned with medals that seemed to multiply with each passing month, dismissed the evidence with a wave of his jeweled hand. The Reichsmarschall had spent the morning hunting on his vast estate, and his mood reflected the supreme confidence of a man who believed his own propaganda. According to historical accounts documented in Edward Jablonski's America in the Air War, published in 1982, Göring's exact words dripped with contempt. "That's impossible. The Americans cannot produce escort fighters with such range." His voice echoed through the chamber, final and absolute, as if reality itself would bend to his decree. But Galland wasn't a man easily silenced. As General der Jagdflieger, general of the fighter arm, he commanded every single-engine fighter unit defending the Reich. His Knight's Cross with oak leaves, swords, and diamonds glittered at his throat, earned not through political maneuvering but through 94 confirmed aerial victories. He'd flown combat missions over Spain, Poland, France, and Britain. He'd seen the Luftwaffe evolve from a conquering force to a desperate defensive shield. And now, he watched helplessly as the man responsible for Germany's air power refused to acknowledge the gathering storm. The reports Galland presented came from multiple sources: Jagdgeschwader 26 operating over northern France, units from Jagdgeschwader 2 in the Paris region, even pilots from Jagdgeschwader 53 who'd encountered these long-range threats near the German border. Each combat report told the same story. American fighters were penetrating deeper into occupied Europe, protecting their bomber formations with unprecedented endurance. The P-38 Lightning, with its Allison engines and revolutionary design, had become a strategic weapon that threatened to crack open Germany's aerial defenses. Göring leaned back in his ornate chair, his corpulent frame settling into the cushions as he fixed Galland with a stare that had intimidated countless subordinates. The Reichsmarschall had built his reputation on certainty, on projecting invincibility, even as the evidence of Germany's declining fortunes mounted daily. To admit that American technology had surpassed German capabilities, to acknowledge that enemy fighters could escort bombers all the way to Berlin itself, such admissions would undermine everything Göring had promised Hitler, everything he'd assured the German people. The intelligence dossier Galland had compiled throughout July and early August 1943 represented months of painstaking work by Luftwaffe reconnaissance units and frontline debriefings. Each page documented a shift in American tactics that spelled disaster for German air defenses. The United States Army Air Forces had recognized their critical vulnerability. Unescorted heavy bombers suffered catastrophic losses to Luftwaffe interceptors. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortresses and consolidated B-24 Liberators, despite their formidable defensive armament, proved devastatingly vulnerable without fighter protection deep inside Reich territory. Galland's staff had tracked the P-38's evolution with growing alarm. The Lightning wasn't new. Lockheed had designed it in the late 1930s, and it had entered service in 1941. What had changed was its range. American engineers, working with desperate urgency, had developed external drop tanks that transformed the P-38 from a capable interceptor into a long-range escort fighter. These cylindrical fuel tanks, mounted beneath the wings, or suspended from the fuselage, could be jettisoned when empty, or when combat demanded maximum maneuverability. This simple innovation had rewritten the mathematics of aerial warfare. The technical specifications told a sobering story. According to documentation later preserved in the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, a P-38, equipped with two 165-gallon drop tanks, could reach combat zones 500 miles from its base, engage enemy fighters, and return safely. The twin 1,200-horsepower Allison V-1710 engines provided reliability that single-engine fighters couldn't match. If one engine failed, the pilot could return home on the other. The aircraft's distinctive configuration, with counter-rotating propellers eliminating torque problems, offered stability that exhausted pilots appreciated during hours-long missions. Galland explained these developments with clinical precision, but Göring's attention wandered. The Reichsmarshal's fingers drummed impatiently on the table as he interrupted. "Your pilots are mistaken. They're seeing our own Messerschmitt 110 destroyers and misidentifying them in the heat of combat." This suggestion, that battle-hardened veterans couldn't distinguish between German twin-engine fighters and American aircraft with their unique twin-boom design, revealed how completely Göring had disconnected from battlefield reality. The Messerschmitt Bf 110, Germany's primary heavy fighter, looked nothing like the P-38. Any pilot who'd actually engaged these aircraft knew the difference instinctively. The meeting ground on through the afternoon, with Galland presenting evidence and Göring manufacturing excuses. Other Luftwaffe officers present, men whose names would later appear in war crime tribunals and historical investigations, remained silent. Speaking truth to power in the Third Reich carried consequences that could extend far beyond damaged careers. Hitler's regime operated on a principle of optimistic reporting, where bearers of bad news found themselves replaced by yes men who told leadership what it wanted to hear. Galland's willingness to persist despite Göring's obvious displeasure testified to either remarkable courage or dangerous naivety. Historical context from Werner Baumbach's memoir, The Life and Death of the Luftwaffe, published in 1960, reveals that this pattern of denial pervaded German military leadership throughout 1943. As Allied forces gained momentum on multiple fronts, Sicily invaded in July, Soviet counteroffensives grinding forward in the east, the Battle of the Atlantic turning against U-boats, Nazi leadership clung to fantasies of wonder weapons and miraculous victories. Göring exemplified this dysfunction, maintaining lavish estates and indulging expensive hobbies, while the Air Force he commanded bled experienced pilots it couldn't replace. Galland left Carenhall that evening with a bitter taste of defeat. He'd presented irrefutable evidence, documented facts compiled by professionals who risked their lives daily. Yet institutional inertia, personal vanity, and ideological blindness had triumphed over truth. The general climbed into his staff car for the journey back to Berlin, knowing that German fighter pilots would continue facing lengthening odds without the strategic adjustments necessary for survival. Above, the summer sky darkened toward twilight, and somewhere to the west, American air crews prepared for missions that would test whether Göring's confidence or Galland's warnings proved prophetic. While Galland struggled against bureaucratic denial in Germany, American air commanders wrestled with their own desperate calculations. Brigadier General Frank Armstrong, serving under Major General Ira Eaker's 8th Air Force Command in England, faced a brutal equation throughout the summer of 1943. Every deep penetration raid into German territory resulted in losses that threatened to make strategic bombing unsustainable. The June 22nd mission to Hulls had cost 16 bombers. The July 28th strike on Oschersleben resulted in 22 B-17s destroyed. These weren't just machines. Each loss meant 10 trained crew members killed, captured, or wounded. The crisis demanded innovation. American factories were producing bombers at rates that staggered imagination. Boeing, Douglas, and Consolidated Plants delivered hundreds of heavy bombers monthly. But training crews took time, and combat experience couldn't be manufactured on assembly lines. The 8th Air Force needed a solution that would protect its bomber streams until they could reach targets deep in Germany, destroy vital industrial facilities, and return to English bases. Fighter escort represented the obvious answer, but the distances involved seemed to defy available technology. Enter the P-38 Lightning, an aircraft that had struggled to find its role in the European theater. The fighter had performed well in North Africa and the Pacific, but European operations exposed troubling problems. The Allison engines, superb at low altitudes, suffered reliability issues in the extreme cold of high-altitude combat over Europe. Pilots reported frequent engine failures, troublesome supercharger systems, and cockpit heating inadequate for missions at 25,000 feet, where temperatures plunged to 40 below zero. Some units had nearly given up on the type entirely, yet the P-38 possessed one irreplaceable advantage: range. While the excellent Republic P-47 Thunderbolt could escort bombers partway into Germany, even with drop tanks it couldn't reach targets deep in the Reich. The nimble North American P-51 Mustang, which would later revolutionize escort operations, was only beginning to reach operational squadrons in its Merlin engine variant during autumn 1943. That left the Lightning as the only fighter capable of accompanying bombers to distant targets and engaging Luftwaffe interceptors hundreds of miles from home bases. American engineering teams attacked the P-38's problems with characteristic determination. According to research detailed in Warren Body's comprehensive The Lockheed P-38 Lightning, published in 1991, technicians developed improved cold weather procedures, modified engine systems for better high-altitude performance, and most critically, perfected the external fuel tank systems that would transform the aircraft into a strategic escort fighter. These drop tanks, manufactured from pressed paper treated with plastic for waterproofing, were cheap enough to be disposable, yet robust enough to survive high-speed flight. The mathematics worked out elegantly. A P-38 carried 310 gallons of internal fuel. Adding two 165-gallon drop tanks brought total capacity to 640 gallons. The twin Allison engines consumed roughly 100 gallons per hour at cruise settings, giving the fighter over 6 hours of endurance. Even accounting for combat operations, high-power settings that drastically increased fuel consumption, and safety reserves for emergencies, the P-38 could escort bombers 500 miles into hostile territory, engage in combat, and return safely. This capability existed nowhere else in the Allied inventory during summer 1943. Fighter groups began receiving adequate supplies of drop tanks in late July. The 55th Fighter Group, flying from Nut Hampstead in England, and the 20th Fighter Group operating from King's Cliff, started extending their range incrementally. Each mission pushed deeper into occupied Europe, testing the limits of man and machine. Pilots learned to manage fuel consumption obsessively, calculating exactly when to drop external tanks to maintain combat capability, while preserving sufficient internal fuel for the return journey. Navigation became critical. Getting lost over hostile territory meant death or capture when fuel ran out. The Luftwaffe noticed these penetrations immediately. German fighter controllers, monitoring Allied radio traffic and tracking raids with increasingly sophisticated radar networks, reported with growing frequency that American escorts were appearing where they shouldn't exist. Intelligence officers compiled reports, forwarded them through channels, and watched as they accumulated in files that men like Galland tried desperately to push up the command chain. But institutional momentum in Nazi Germany flowed downward from Hitler's bunker and Göring's palaces, not upward from battlefield reality. August 17, 1943 arrived with clear skies over England, perfect flying weather that bomber crews had learned to dread. Perfect visibility meant German fighters would intercept attacking formations with devastating precision. On this morning, the 8th Air Force launched what would become known as the first Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission, an audacious double strike designed to overwhelm German defenses through complexity. 315 heavy bombers departed from bases across eastern England, targeting ball-bearing factories in Schweinfurt and Messerschmitt production facilities in Regensburg. The bite missions would test American strategic bombing theory and expose the brutal reality Galland had warned about. The Regensburg force, designated the 4th Bombardment Wing, consisted of 146 B-17s, tasked with an unprecedented mission profile. After bombing Messerschmitt factories, they wouldn't return to England, but instead continue southward to bases in North Africa, theoretically confusing German defenses. The Schweinfurt strike force would follow later, hitting ball-bearing production facilities critical to German war production. American planners believed this complicated assault would stretch Luftwaffe resources beyond their capacity to respond effectively. They were catastrophically wrong. P-38 fighters from the 55th Fighter Group provided escort for the initial penetration, shepherding the bomber stream as far as their fuel allowed. But even with drop tanks, the Lightnings could only accompany the bombers partway into Germany before turning back. At the limit of their range, around Eupen on the German-Belgian border, the escorts waggled their wings in salute and peeled away, leaving the bombers exposed. What followed demonstrated exactly what Galland had tried to explain to Göring. Without fighter protection, even heavily armed bombers became vulnerable prey. Luftwaffe fighter wings descended on the unescorted formations like wolves on wounded caribou. Jagdgeschwader 1, Jagdgeschwader 11, Jagdgeschwader 26, elite units equipped with Messerschmitt Bf 109 and Focke-Wulf FW 190 fighters, launched wave after coordinated wave against the bomber streams. German pilots employed tactics refined through years of combat, head-on attacks that maximized closing speeds while minimizing exposure to defensive fire, coordinated assaults from multiple directions that overwhelmed gunners' ability to track threats, and relentless pursuit of damaged aircraft that had fallen out of formation. The carnage unfolded across 400 miles of German sky. B-17s trailing smoke and flame fell from formation, some exploding in midair when fuel tanks or bomb loads detonated, others spiraling downward with dead engines or shattered control surfaces. Parachutes blossomed across the landscape as crews abandoned doomed aircraft. Some men died in their positions, manning guns until the moment their bombers disintegrated around them. Others survived the violent bailout sequence only to face capture and imprisonment for the war's duration. A few evaded capture entirely, beginning long odysseys through occupied Europe toward neutral countries or Allied lines. The Regensburg force lost 24 bombers, 16% of the attacking formation. The Schweinfurt mission fared even worse, losing 36 aircraft, 22% casualties. Combined, the 8th Air Force lost 60 heavy bombers in a single day, representing 600 trained crew members killed or captured. Another aircraft limped back to England so badly damaged they required extensive repairs, or were written off entirely. These losses exceeded sustainable attrition rates by any measure. Historical analysis contained in Richard Davis's Carl A. Spots and the Air War in Europe confirms that such casualty rates, if continued, would have destroyed the 8th Air Force's combat effectiveness within months. Galland received detailed combat reports from Luftwaffe units within hours of the mission's conclusion. German fighter pilots filed claims for 117 American bombers destroyed. Typical overclaiming in the chaos of combat meant the actual total of 60 was still devastating enough. More significantly for Galland's ongoing argument with Göring, every report mentioned the absence of American escort fighters deep inside Germany. The Luftwaffe had achieved this triumph precisely because the bombers flew unprotected through the most dangerous portions of their route. Galland immediately prepared a follow-up report for his superiors, hoping that such catastrophic American losses might finally convince Göring to take the escort fighter threat seriously. But Göring interpreted Schweinfurt-Regensburg entirely differently. To the Reichsmarschall, the mission proved his contention that American strategic bombing would fail when confronted by determined German defenses. He crowed about the victory in communications to Hitler and in propaganda broadcasts. Rather than recognizing this success as a temporary advantage dependent on American technological limitations, Göring treated it as validation of Luftwaffe's superiority. This fundamental misreading of strategic reality would prove disastrous in coming months when American engineering solved the escort problem definitively. While German leadership celebrated their August victory, American engineers accelerated work on solutions that would render those celebrations tragically premature. The P-38 program received urgent attention, but more significantly, another aircraft was emerging from relative obscurity to become the war's most important fighter. The North American P-51 Mustang had entered service in 1942, powered by Allison engines similar to those in the Lightning. In that configuration, the Mustang performed adequately at low altitudes, but lacked the high-altitude performance necessary for bomber escort deep into Germany. Everything changed when someone suggested fitting the Mustang with the British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. The Merlin transformation represented one of warfare's great technological success stories. Packard Motor Car Company, licensed to produce Merlin engines in the United States, began delivering the V1650 variant, optimized for American production. When installed in the Mustang's sleek airframe, the Merlin produced extraordinary results. The combination of efficient aerodynamics, powerful engine, and refined design created a fighter with performance characteristics that matched or exceeded anything in the Luftwaffe inventory. More crucially, equipped with external fuel tanks, the Merlin Mustang could escort bombers to any target in Germany and return to English bases. According to documentation in the official Army Air Force's history, Europe, Argument to VE Day, the first Merlin-powered P-51B models reached operational squadrons in October 1943, with full-scale deployment accelerating through winter. The 54th Fighter Group converted to Mustangs in November, followed rapidly by other units. By January 1944, dozens of groups were trading their P-38s and P-47s for the revolutionary new escort fighter. American industry, achieving production miracles that German planners had believed impossible, began delivering Mustangs by the hundreds each month. Meanwhile, P-38 deployments continued expanding. The aircraft remained problematic in the extreme conditions of high-altitude European combat, but numbers and tactical evolution compensated for technical shortcomings. Pilots developed techniques for managing the Lightning's quirks, carefully monitoring engine temperatures, understanding the aircraft's compressibility characteristics in high-speed dives, and exploiting its excellent range and firepower against German interceptors. The 55th, 20th, and newly arrived 54th Fighter Groups accumulated experience and expertise, learning lessons written in the blood of pilots who pushed the Lightning beyond its design envelope. German intelligence detected these developments, but struggled to convince leadership of their implications. Luftwaffe reconnaissance aircraft occasionally photographed Allied airfields, returning with evidence of growing fighter strength. Frontline pilots filed increasingly urgent reports about improved American escort tactics and longer fighter presence over German territory. Yet Göring's staff systematically minimized these warnings, filtering information to present optimistic assessments that aligned with what the Reichsmarschall wanted to hear. This institutional dishonesty created a feedback loop where fantasy replaced reality in strategic planning. Galland found himself fighting a two-front war, against Allied air power in the sky and against bureaucratic incompetence on the ground. As General der Jagdflieger, he theoretically controlled Germany's fighter defense, but practical authority required support from Göring and ultimately Hitler. When that support evaporated in the face of inconvenient truths, Galland could only watch helplessly as opportunities slipped away. Germany possessed talented engineers and sophisticated aircraft designs, but Nazi leadership squandered these advantages through ideological blindness and catastrophic resource allocation decisions. The Focke-Wulf Ta-152, an advanced interceptor design, languished in development while resources flowed to vanity projects like the Messerschmitt Me 210, a jet fighter years away from meaningful production. The excellent Messerschmitt Me 409G, backbone of Luftwaffe fighter squadrons, suffered from inadequate production numbers and chronic fuel shortages as Allied bombing disrupted synthetic petroleum facilities. Most critically, the Luftwaffe bled experienced pilots it couldn't replace. Men with hundreds of combat hours fell in battle, and their replacements arrived with minimal training and almost no chance of survival against veteran American fighter pilots. By October 1943, the strategic situation had shifted decisively. American fighters routinely penetrated deep into German airspace. The Black Thursday mission against Schweinfurt on October 14th cost the 8th Air Force another 60 bombers, but this time American planners recognized the lesson. Deep penetration missions without adequate escort were temporarily suspended, while fighter deployment accelerated. Galland understood what this pause meant. The Americans were regrouping, preparing for a renewed offensive with overwhelming force. He compiled yet another report for Göring, detailing the growing crisis and pleading for immediate action. The response arrived swiftly. Göring refused to meet with him, dismissing the report as defeatist speculation. The Reichsmarschall preferred hunting trips and art collection to confronting strategic reality. January 1944 arrived with brutal cold gripping Europe and an ominous calm over Germany's skies. American bomber operations had decreased during late 1943, but German intelligence officers who understood strategic bombing theory recognized this lull as preparation rather than retreat. The 8th Air Force was accumulating strength, more bomber groups, more escort fighters, and critically growing numbers of those troublesome Merlin-powered Mustangs that could accompany bombers anywhere in the Reich. Galland's warnings from August had proven prophetic, but vindication offered cold comfort when Germany's leadership had wasted precious months that might have been used preparing adequate defenses. The Americans launched their renewed offensive on January 11th with raids against aircraft production facilities at Oschersleben and Halberstadt. This time, something had changed dramatically. P-38 Lightnings and the new P-51 Mustangs escorted the bombers throughout their entire mission, engaging Luftwaffe interceptors over targets deep inside Germany. German fighter pilots, accustomed to attacking unescorted bomber formations at will, found themselves caught in desperate dogfights with American escorts that refused to leave. The technological advantage Göring had insisted was impossible had become devastating reality. Major General James Doolittle, who assumed command of the 8th Air Force in January 1944, implemented aggressive new tactics that exploited American numerical and technological advantages. Rather than keeping fighters tethered closely to bomber formations, Doolittle authorized his escort pilots to pursue German interceptors aggressively. American fighters began sweeping ahead of bomber streams, intercepting Luftwaffe formations before they could organize attacks. When German fighters attempted to break through escort screens, veteran American pilots with hours of combat experience in superior aircraft cut them to pieces. The hunter had become the hunted. The Luftwaffe's casualty rates skyrocketed. During January and February 1944, German fighter units lost hundreds of pilots, not just aircraft, which factories could replace, but experienced combat veterans whose skills couldn't be recreated in truncated training programs. New pilots arrived at frontline squadrons with perhaps 30 hours of flight time compared to the 100-plus hours American pilots received. These inexperienced youngsters, thrown into combat against battle-hardened opponents flying superior equipment, died in horrifying numbers. Entire staffels, squadrons, were wiped out in single engagements. Replacement pilots often survived only a handful of missions before being killed or wounded. Galland attempted to reorganize German fighter defenses around these brutal new realities. He advocated concentrating fighters into large formations that could overwhelm escort screens through numbers, accepting heavy losses in exchange for breaking through to the bombers. He pushed for accelerated production of heavily armed and armored destroyer aircraft like the Me-410 that could survive defensive fire long enough to damage bombers significantly. He begged for adequate fuel allocations to train replacement pilots properly. Every proposal ran into bureaucratic obstacles, resource shortages, or Göring's active opposition. The Reichsmarschall, increasingly disconnected from operational reality, blamed frontline commanders for failures that stemmed directly from strategic decisions made in Berlin palaces. The situation deteriorated through a series of hammer blows that American planners called Big Week. Between February 20th and 26th, 1944, the 8th Air Force launched massive strikes against German aircraft production facilities. Over 3,000 bomber sorties, protected by thousands of fighter escort missions, struck targets across Germany. The Luftwaffe threw everything available into defending these vital facilities, losing over 300 fighters and irreplaceable pilots. American losses, while substantial, could be absorbed by an industrial system producing aircraft and training crews faster than combat consumed them. Germany had no equivalent capacity. Historical accounts preserved in official Luftwaffe documents reveal that Göring finally accepted reality sometime in late February or early March 1944. The exact moment of his psychological collapse remains unclear, but contemporaneous reports describe the Reichsmarschall's growing withdrawal from operational decisions. The confident proclamations about German aerial superiority ceased. Göring spent increasing time at Hall, avoiding his headquarters and refusing meetings with frontline commanders. When Hitler demanded explanations for Luftwaffe failures, Göring offered excuses and scapegoats rather than strategic analysis. The institution he'd commanded since the Nazi Party's earliest days was disintegrating, and he lacked the moral courage to confront his role in that destruction. Galland watched this institutional decay with frustrated impotence. He'd warned about the escort fighter threat in August 1943, 7 months before Big Week demolished German fighter defenses. 7 months during which Germany might have accelerated advanced fighter programs, modified defensive tactics, or prepared industrial dispersal plans. 7 months wasted because one man's vanity and ideological blindness prevented institutional learning. The cost of that delay was measured in thousands of German pilots killed, hundreds of bombers and escorts lost to futile resistance, and a steady erosion of Germany's capacity to defend its airspace against the growing Allied aerial armada. Spring 1944 brought Germany's aerial defense to complete collapse. American bombers ranged across the Reich virtually at will, escorted by swarms of P-51 Mustangs that hunted German interceptors with methodical efficiency. The Luftwaffe still possessed capable aircraft and brave pilots, but numbers and logistics had turned decisively against them. Fuel shortages grounded fighters even when threats approached. The aviation fuel crisis, stemming from successful Allied bombing of synthetic petroleum plants, meant that pilots lucky enough to reach operational squadrons often lacked sufficient fuel for adequate training flights, let alone combat missions. Galland's relationship with Göring deteriorated into open hostility. During increasingly rare meetings, the two men argued bitterly about strategic priorities and resource allocation. Galland advocated abandoning all offensive operations and concentrating Germany's remaining aerial strength on fighter defense. Göring, still clinging to Hitler's demand for retaliation bombing against England, insisted on diverting resources to bomber units that had virtually no chance of reaching their targets. These arguments typically ended with Göring storming out or having Galland removed from his presence, leaving critical decisions unmade and festering problems unaddressed. The introduction of jet fighters represented a final, desperate gamble. The Messerschmitt Me-262 Schwalbe offered performance so superior to conventional fighters that it seemed capable of restoring German aerial parity despite overwhelming Allied numerical advantages. With maximum speeds approaching 550 miles per hour, roughly 100 miles per hour faster than any Allied fighter, the Me-262 could attack bomber formations, complete firing passes, and escape before escorts could intercept. Hitler, fascinated by the jet's potential, demanded its deployment as a bomber rather than the pure fighter Galland advocated. This fundamental disagreement over the Me-262's role consumed months of development time and resulted in compromised designs that satisfied nobody. According to Walter Boyne's Clash of Wings, published in 1994, the first operational Me-262 units entered combat in July 1944, nearly a year after Galland's warnings about long-range escorts. By then, Allied air superiority was so complete that even revolutionary technology couldn't reverse strategic realities. The jet scored some successes, but chronic mechanical problems, fuel shortages, and vulnerability during takeoff and landing limited their effectiveness. Allied fighters learned to patrol German jet bases, catching Me-262s when they were most vulnerable. The revolutionary aircraft that might have changed everything arrived too late, in too small numbers, and hampered by leadership decisions that prioritized ideology over effectiveness. Galland's tenure as General der Jagdflieger ended in January 1945, when he was relieved following bitter disputes with Göring and Hitler over fighter tactics and resource allocation. In his final months of command, he'd watched the force he'd spent years building destroyed piecemeal by an opponent whose capabilities he'd accurately predicted but couldn't convince his superiors to take seriously. The Luftwaffe that had dominated European skies in 1941 through brilliant tactics and superior equipment had been reduced to a hollow shell, capable of occasional local successes, but strategically irrelevant against the Allied aerial juggernaut. Göring's final months in power were marked by complete psychological and physical deterioration. The man who'd promised Hitler he could supply Stalingrad by air, who'd assured the German people that no enemy bombs would fall on Berlin, who'd dismissed warnings about American long-range escorts as impossible, that man retreated into morphine addiction and fantasy. He spent the war's final months in a drugged haze, alternately raging against subordinates for failures he'd caused and withdrawing into delusions about miraculous weapons that would restore German fortunes. When American forces captured him in May 1945, Göring seemed genuinely surprised that Germany had lost the war. The personal tragedy of these two men, Galland the capable professional frustrated by incompetent leadership, Göring the vain narcissist whose deficiencies destroyed the institution he commanded, reflected larger failures throughout Nazi Germany's military and political structure. The Third Reich system actively punished truth-tellers while rewarding sycophants who reinforced leadership delusions. This fundamental dysfunction meant that warnings like Galland's August 1943 report about long-range escorts were systematically ignored until events forced recognition, by which time corrective action became impossible. The Luftwaffe's collapse stemmed not from lack of technology or brave personnel, but from leadership that preferred comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths. The August 10, 1943 meeting at Hall, where Galland warned Göring about American long-range escort fighters, became, in historical retrospect, one of the war's crucial missed opportunities. Had German leadership responded appropriately, accelerating jet fighter development, reorganizing defensive tactics, dispersing aircraft production facilities, prioritizing pilot training, the aerial campaign's outcome might not have changed, but its cost certainly would have increased substantially. Instead, denial and institutional dysfunction gifted the Allies 7 critical months during which American industrial might and technical innovation created insurmountable advantages. Post-war interrogations of surviving Luftwaffe personnel revealed the depth of this institutional failure. American and British intelligence officers, conducting detailed interviews with German commanders, discovered repeated instances of accurate intelligence being systematically ignored or suppressed. Galland's warnings about P-38 range were neither isolated nor unique. Similar reports about Soviet tank production, Allied landing craft numbers, and strategic bombing effectiveness had all been dismissed because they contradicted leadership expectations. The Nazi system, built on ideological certainty and leadership infallibility, couldn't accommodate information that challenged its fundamental assumptions. Galland survived the war and eventually wrote his memoirs, The First and the Last, published in 1954. The book provided first-hand accounts of Luftwaffe operations and offered surprisingly candid assessments of German failures. His description of the August 1943 meeting with Göring emphasized not just the Reichsmarschall's denial, but the broader institutional culture that made such denial possible. Galland noted that presenting accurate intelligence often marked officers as defeatists, while those who fabricated optimistic reports received promotions and rewards. This inverted incentive structure ensured that leadership decisions were based on fantasy rather than reality. The American side of this story reflected more positively on institutional learning and adaptation. When deep penetration missions revealed bomber vulnerability, American commanders didn't deny the problem. They solved it. Engineering teams improved existing aircraft, accelerated development of revolutionary designs like the Merlin Mustang, and refined tactics to exploit technological advantages. This flexible, problem-solving approach contrasted sharply with German rigidity. American military culture, while far from perfect, at least permitted junior officers to challenge assumptions and allowed technical experts to influence strategic decisions. These organizational advantages mattered as much as industrial capacity in determining the aerial war's outcome. The lessons from this episode resonated through subsequent military history. Modern armed forces study Galland's experience as a cautionary tale about the dangers of telling leadership what it wants to hear rather than what it needs to know. Military education emphasizes creating institutional cultures that reward accurate reporting, even when that accuracy reveals uncomfortable truths. The concept of red teams, designated contrarians tasked with challenging assumptions and identifying flaws in operational planning, stems partly from recognition that organizations require deliberate mechanisms to prevent the kind of groupthink that paralyzed German decision-making. Technical lessons from the long-range escort fighter development influenced post-war aviation design. The P-51 Mustang's combination of range, performance, and efficiency demonstrated that seemingly contradictory capabilities could coexist through careful engineering. Modern fighter design still grapples with these trade-offs, speed versus range, maneuverability versus payload capacity, stealth versus weapons load. The solutions developed during World War II, particularly the use of external fuel tanks and careful aerodynamic optimization, established principles that remain relevant 80 years later. The human dimension of this story, Galland's frustration at being ignored, Göring's tragic inability to confront reality, the thousands of pilots who died because of these failures, reminds us that warfare isn't just about technology and tactics. It's about people, institutions, and the decisions that determine who lives and who dies. Galland's warnings in August 1943 could have saved countless lives on both sides by forcing earlier German adaptation or possibly even contributing to earlier war termination. Instead, denial and dysfunction prolonged the conflict and increased its human cost immeasurably. Today, historians recognize the August 10, 1943 meeting at Carenhall as a crystallizing moment when different choices might have altered trajectories. Göring's flat dismissal of Galland's warnings encapsulated everything wrong with Nazi Germany's military leadership: arrogance over expertise, ideology over evidence, personal vanity over strategic necessity. The long-range P-38 Lightning, dismissed as impossible, became one of many Allied innovations that overwhelmed German defenses, despite desperate resistance by brave men betrayed by incompetent leadership. The final accounting of this strategic failure extends beyond military statistics into broader historical judgment. The Luftwaffe lost approximately 70,000 trained aircrew during the war: pilots, navigators, radio operators, and gunners whose skills represented years of training and irreplaceable experience. Many of these losses occurred after August 1943, during the period when American long-range escorts systematically dismantled German air defenses. While impossible to calculate precisely how many lives might have been saved through earlier adaptation to this threat, the human cost of Göring's denial, numbered certainly in the thousands, possibly in the tens of thousands when accounting for cascading effects on bomber crew casualties, ground personnel killed in airfield attacks, and civilians who died in raids that might have been disrupted by more effective defenses. The broader strategic implications rippled across all theaters of World War II. Allied air supremacy, achieved partly through the long-range escort fighter capability Göring dismissed as impossible, enabled the Normandy invasion in June 1944. Without control of French skies, the D-Day landings would have faced far more formidable opposition. German reinforcements might have reached Normandy beaches more quickly, panzer divisions could have maneuvered without constant air attack, and the entire campaign's outcome might have shifted. Similarly, the combined bomber offensive's destruction of German synthetic petroleum production, rail networks, and industrial facilities, all made possible by escort fighters protecting the bomber streams, crippled Wehrmacht operations across Europe. Tank divisions sat immobilized for lack of fuel, fighter wings remained grounded, and German armies lost the mobility that had characterized their early war successes. Göring himself faced justice at Nuremberg, where the International Military Tribunal convicted him on multiple counts, including crimes against peace and war crimes. During his trial testimony in March 1946, prosecutors questioned him about Luftwaffe failures and strategic decisions. Göring attempted to portray himself as a competent commander, undermined by circumstances beyond his control: inadequate resources, Hitler's interference, impossible strategic demands. The trial record, preserved in the official Nuremberg documents, reveals how thoroughly Göring had deluded himself about his role and responsibilities. Even facing execution, he couldn't acknowledge that his vanity, incompetence, and refusal to accept uncomfortable truths had contributed materially to Germany's defeat and the deaths of hundreds of thousands under his command. Galland, by contrast, cooperated with Allied interrogators and provided extensive technical information about German aviation during the war. His willingness to speak candidly about